but nothing to compare with the Russians. The Russians have massive military industrial factories. They're churning out weapons and equipment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They've got brand new equipment now they did not have a year ago or over a year ago. In other words, the force on the ground that we face today in Ukraine is infinitely stronger and more capable and lethal than what existed in January of 2022. We've done that. We've induced the Russians to make those investments and expand. The Ukrainians don't have much. Now, when we say much, what does much mean? How effective can a force be when it consists of German, Czech, Dutch, Lithuanian, British, French equipment? And if you go back and look at the Second World War, one of the key lessons that all we in the West tended to learn from the experience of the Germans in the East was the criticality of minimizing the diversity of equipment. In other words, use as many of the same engines as you can. In other words, simplify the resupply of forces and repair parts and the logistical infrastructure. At one point, if you go back and look at someone like General Balk's memoirs, he talks about 7 different vehicles with 7 different engines and 7 different supply and repair part infrastructure requirements on the Eastern Front in his divisional formation. And he only at that point had a division of perhaps 9 or 10,000. And it was a nightmare to keep all of these different systems running because you never had enough to service everything. Well, this is the Ukrainian position now. They have too many different pieces of equipment. How do you keep them all running? And there's a tendency now to use it. If it breaks down, dump it, go get another something, replace it, and move on. That's very difficult to do over time. It's going to become more difficult when the Russians are breathing down your neck. Remember that the Russians have been defending largely. In other words, they ceded the operational initiative, in a sense, to the Ukrainians by allowing them to organize, mobilize, assemble, and attack. Well, the Ukrainians haven't got much left to do that with. I told you what I think they have left and what they might be able to do. But then you have the equipment nightmare, the resupply nightmare. And these nightmares aren't getting any better. Whereas on the Russian side, the situation is infinitely better now. They've moved forward large caches of equipment and ammunition. Things are positioned where they can be rapidly pushed forward and resupply their troops. Ukrainians don't have any of that going on right now. So I feel badly in the sense that I think there are probably people in Washington and London who are saying, now, listen here, Mr. Zelensky, you need to demonstrate that you're real and you've got to put forward this effort or we're not going to be able to support you. I'm sure some of that's going on right now. But if you're a European watching this debacle, at some point you must say, good Lord, how many people are we willing to sacrifice? How many more Ukrainians have to die? How many more millions of refugees are we going to have to deal with in Europe? These are all legitimate questions. At some point, the pressure to end this and return to normalcy will be very great in Berlin and Paris. Remember, the British, like the Americans, sit on islands, remote from the scene of the action. That's the problem. We have always been remote. And when things don't go our way, what do, Glenn? We sail or fly away because we don't live there. Remember, it goes back to Charles de Gaulle, kept saying people in the continent need to understand. The Americans don't live in Europe, and England is an island. I mean, come on, wake up. They don't share the same fate as the continental Europeans.
But I was curious about this new weapons nonetheless, because you mentioned the British. I think they've been very much in the lead of these escalations. I mean, they're the ones who were pushing heavy for tanks. They sent this the ammunition with depleted uranium. And of course, these new long-distance weapons. Do you see any of this as being a big game changer, something that can give the Ukrainians significant a significant advantage? We keep talking about, turning the tide, and which is kind of a contradiction in terms, because we keep saying that Ukrainians are winning, they're winning, yet we have to turn the tide. So there's some faults in the narrative, obviously, but do you see any of these weapons being something that can make a decisive difference?
Well, you recall the enormous detonations and explosions we witnessed near Khmelnytsky in western Ukraine, where you had large numbers of these Storm Shadow missiles and DU rounds stored for eventual disposition and use on the front. Again, as I pointed out earlier, the Russians know where these caches are. They know where the supplies are, and they have been systematically destroying them. So even though you may get 20, 30, 40 Storm Shadow missiles, how many of those are ever going to reach the front? Now, I don't know what the number is that has actually gotten there. I do know that they fired some, and I do know that a small number, 1, 2, or 3, have actually made it through integrated air defenses on the Russian side and hit some targets down south. Is that going to make a difference? 3 missiles? In other words, if you had 1,000 missiles at your disposal with which you could attack in support of your ground forces, which were thoroughly organized, trained, and equipped with predictable sets of equipment after predictable, periods of long-term training, then I would say you had a shot at doing some real damage and making a difference. That doesn't exist. Those conditions don't exist. So the big answer to your question is no. If you can pinpoint a target in Kramatorsk or a target outside of Dnipro or a target anywhere else in Ukraine that you think harbors equipment, weapons, troops with impunity, and that's what the Russians could do right now, how far can you really expect the Ukrainians to get? I don't think very far.
And well, I also wanted to ask you about how you see NATO being impacted by this war, because there's a lot of official statements, obviously, both by the officials, but also in the media. The main argument that NATO's getting stronger, they're more unified than ever, and obviously the concerns of Russia certainly becomes a source of solidarity. But on the other hand, I also hear people like Lawrence Wilkerson, who was a retired U.S. colonel and also chief of staff for Colin Powell, who argues that the Europeans are becoming more apprehensive about the U.S. Not contributing to provoke this war, but also not wanting to make any negotiations and continuing with the British, of course, to escalate. But more importantly, Wilkerson pointed out that what he saw was that the Europeans were becoming the major economic victim in this war, and besides from Ukraine, obviously, who suffer more humanitarian level, but for this reason, as the Europeans now are weakened and becomes excessively dependent on the US, he argues that there's a lot of resentment coming up from the surface. Then obviously Macron being the key example of this new pushback. But so he actually questions whether or not NATO will be able to survive if this war drags on. Do you see it in a similar way, or how do you see NATO coming out of this war?
On or about 9 or 10 January, I was invited to participate in a discussion on this topic. There were several questions. The one was, and this was at the Center for the National Interest, which has since gone out of existence. Dimitri Simes was the moderator for the discussion. And at the time they said, well, will the Russians go in? I said, absolutely. Everybody else said, well, it's unclear. We'll have to see. No, I don't think so. They'll never risk it, blah, blah, blah. Then the next question was, well, what's the impact on NATO? And I said then that I did not think the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would survive the war. It's very simple. You have 30 plus nations. Most of them have interests that other nations within the alliance don't share. If you stand in Rome or Athens or Sofia, you have a different strategic picture from the people that live in Berlin, Oslo, or Amsterdam. You don't see the world the same way. You don't see the same world if you're in Paris. In other words, where you sit has a big impact on your view of things. Secondly, if we had brought this war to a rapid close, say we'd interrupted the operations at the end of February and beginning of March and say, wait a minute, that's enough. We have to arrange peace talks. Let's have a ceasefire. We'll host it. And Ukrainians and Russians will work this out, and we will be supportive of whatever the two sides can reach in terms of an agreement. We didn't do that. And so now the opportunity for that kind of thing is really very, very weak. So I think that inside Europe, once you get past the facade, you go behind the facade of unity, there's extreme concern about what will happen. You have the Norwegians, for instance, who are very interested in having the United States help protect their interests in the North Atlantic and protect their border with Russia up on the Arctic Circle. What do you do if at the end of this whole thing, if the continental Europeans say, well, we've had enough? The only thing the Americans have done is drag us into a destructive war that we didn't need to fight against a country that really wasn't our enemy, contrary to the popular belief and the standard narrative and propaganda. That's when you're going to see things break down. And I think that's coming. I think it's already being discussed behind the scenes, but it's going to break out into the open. You've already had comments slipping out from the French, from Macron and others to suggest this. And again, if you're in Southern Europe, you see the world as one way. If you're in Western, another. If you're in Central East, another. It's very hard to hold a large alliance like that together in peacetime, let alone in war. So I don't have any faith at all that this thing called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization will survive this entire crisis. I'd be very surprised if it did.